there is a foundation for what is the human purpose. Why are we alive? What is the destiny that could be yours? What should you be doing? Maybe that you're failing to do. Well, worship is quite the subject. Turn with me to John in the Gospels. Turn with me to the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, chapter 4 and verse 24, where John says this. It's a very interesting, insightful comment that John is inspired by the Spirit to make here. God is Spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. See, this time of year, this subject is very pertinent, because there are a lot of people who think they are going to worship God, but are they? Are they truly worshiping God? God says God is Spirit, the apostle says, and those who worship Him, must, this isn't optional, it's he said, must, if you're going to worship the God of the Bible, you must worship in spirit and truth. Now, that's a remarkable statement of John's. Now, the literal word order of the Greek in the Scriptures, is quite, I want to mention it because it's quite interesting. Though it sounds a little bit like Yoda in Star Wars, from this standpoint. But the Greek puts it this way, literally, the Greek word order is this. Spirit, God is, and those worshiping Him in spirit and truth, it behooves to worship. Worship in the Greek Scriptures is the words, and you'll find this in the Strong's lexicon, the word 4352. It's proskuneo. Proskuneo. It comes from pros. It's a formation of two words, actually. It comes from pros, which means towards, and kuneo, which means to kiss. Properly, the proskuneo, or the worship, means to kiss the ground when prostrating before a superior. It could be used, not just in religion, worshiping God, but that's what you would do to a king. It says to worship, ready to fall down, prostrate oneself, to adore. So, worship is from the Greek word proskuneo. It's Strong's 4352. It's from two Greek words, pros, which means towards, and kuneo, which means to kiss. Properly, the lexicon says to kiss the ground when prostrating before a superior, to worship, ready to fall down, prostrate oneself, to adore on one's knees, do obeisance. The basic meaning of proskuneo, in the opinion of most scholars, is to kiss. And they say, in the ancient world, if you look on Egyptian reliefs, in tombs and stuff like this, worshipers are represented with outstretched arms throwing a kiss to the deity. So, proskuneo has been metaphorically described as the kissing ground between believers, that is the bride, and Christ, the heavenly bridegroom. Now, the lexicon notes, and they make this comment, while this is true, proskuneo, Strong 4352, suggests the willingness to make all necessary physical gestures of obeisance. I want to repeat that. The kissing, this kissing ground, which is a nice romantic, perhaps, looking at the worship as being the kissing ground between Christ and His church. But the kissing ground, proskuneo, to throw a kiss, suggests the willingness on the part of the worshiper to make all necessary physical gestures of obeisance, to obey, to comply, to do what is requested. Let's take a look at this, how proskuneo is used here a little bit. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2, and we'll start with verse 1. This is an appropriate time of year. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1, New Living Translation. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men, that is, magi, which was a class of astrologers and wise men from the kingdom or the empire of Parthia to the east. About that time, some wise men from the eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, can you see it? They show up at the city and they start asking people in the marketplace, where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him. Proskuneo. Okay, we've come to throw him a kiss, as it were. Come to the kissing ground. Verse 3, King Herod, who is Herod the Great, was deeply disturbed when he heard this. When the market rumors from all his spies and his toadies and all this that came back to him, King, you got these guys are saying the Messiah, the King of the Jews, has been born. Yeah, Herod was deeply disturbed deeply disturbed. It's very interesting the way Matthew puts it. And he's catching Herod's character here. Was deeply disturbed when Bible prophecy is being fulfilled. Herod saying, "Oh no," because Herod, knowing the man and the story of everything that was said about Herod, he jealously worshipped his exclusive right to power within his own domains. You might acknowledge Caesar, Caesar, who would sometimes say, he'd rather be Herod's pig rather than Herod's son because he murdered some people in his own family. This is a ruthless man. But when Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, as was everyone in Jerusalem, because all of a sudden the status quo was in play. People get nervous, especially those in power, those who have vested interest, when all of a sudden the status quo is in play. So verse 4, Herod called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? Verse 5, in Bethlehem in Judea, they said, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. These leading teachers of religious law and the priests, they were quoting, of course, they were from the prophecy of Micah 5:2. Let's just take a look at this real quick. I'm going to cite this in Expanded Bible version. This is Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are too small to be, or too insignificant to be among the army groups from the clans of Judah, from you will come one who will rule Israel for me. That is to say, the Messiah. He comes, that is, his origins are, or his goings out are, he comes, this Messiah, from very old times, from ancient times, from days long ago. When you think about that, what Micah was saying was rather a remarkable indication, and even to this day, it is missed by most people what he was talking about. But Jesus quite clearly made that he was, because he made this testimony in John 8 where he said, before Abraham was, I am. And, all those, the Pharisees who were talking about back then knew who he was claiming to be as God's son, as the Messiah. I am. Well, this was the one who would stand on Mount Sinai. This is the one who met Moses. So certainly he was saying that for the one who will rule Israel for me, he comes from ancient times, from days long ago. Such a one is going to be worthy of worship for sure. So let's go back. Let's go back here to this account here in Matthew 2. Verse 7, when Herod, let's see, after Herod heard, he got his intelligence of, okay, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and proskuneo. I can go and worship him too, said the alligator to the duck. Anyways, it's the Herod, would permit no interest of his to, nothing to interfere. It's like Herod was saying to the magi, to the wise men. He was saying, and one of the commentators put it away, that I, Herod, also would permit no interest of mine to interfere with the decrees of heaven, may come with my family in court to pay homage to the newborn king, a duty to which I look upon myself as peculiarly obligated. No, Herod may have been put that, so if when you find him, come back and tell me so I can go and worship too. So I can go and throw him a kiss, proskuneo. Not what he had in mind. As the commentator says, mark the hypocrisy of this perfidious tyrant. Herod's character is perfectly revealed by Matthew, troubled at hearing the news, and deep, crafty, subtle, pretending one thing but intending another, professing to have a design of worshiping Jesus when his real purpose was to murder him. Yeah, there are many people who will pretend to worship Jesus, but only do so hypocritically, like Herod did. So back to Matthew 2. After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house. See, this is considerably time later. He's no longer in a stable or a manger, this sort of thing. Time has passed. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Jesus, and they bowed down. They fell down. They kneeled and worshipped him, proskuneo. And they opened their treasure chests and gave him, as a king that they recognized, gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I thought it was very interesting when I was just looking at the interlinear and I was looking at the Greek here, gifts of gold and frankincense. Frankincense is from the Greek word Lebanos, which I can't help but think of Lebanon. Gifts of gold, frankincense, Lebanos, and myrrh, which is Smyrna. I thought that was very interesting, that the Greeks called myrrh Smyrna. Which refers to a city. You think about that in Revelation and a few things like this. You think about some of the prophecies about Lebanon. Anyways, that's just out there from this aspect. So they worshipped him. They, proskuneo, the Magi did. Of course, they didn't go back to Herod. God did warn them and said, no, this guy is lying through his teeth. Don't do that. But you know what Herod did. He was a murderer. He was indeed a murderer. I mean, he was a hypocrite in saying he was going to worship, from this standpoint. It's amazing how God introduces and opens the Gospel of Matthew, where those from other nations, the Magi, Parthians, descendants of the Scythians probably. Very interesting, the story of that. They saw his star rising in the east and came to worship him. You worship a man? God doesn't rebuke that. It's very interesting. We go to Exodus. Let's go to Exodus chapter 34 and verse 14. Exodus 34 and verse 14. Where the God of the Old Covenant said this, "For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God." You're not supposed to worship anyone else. In Hebrew, the word for worship is Strong 7812. It's shahach. There's a good ha in there. Shahach, which also means to bow down, prostrate oneself before a monarch or superior in homage, humbly beseech, do reverence, worship. See, this was this comment. The word really hadn't changed much from, the concept from Greek or Hebrew is the same sort of concept for worship. You're to bow down, you're prostrating, you're humbling yourself before a superior. In homage, doing reverence, you're worshiping, throwing him a kiss. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12. What was this worship that God was requiring in the Hebrew scriptures of the children of Israel? Deuteronomy 10 and verse 12. "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you?" Okay, here's a good question. What do you have to live up to? What is God looking down there, and what is he requiring of you? You've got to pay attention to in his worship. He said, because remember, Moses was giving this in Deuteronomy here just before they were to go into their promised land. And so it was a sort of reminder, okay, you're getting ready and you're going to go into the promised land and you're going to get your inheritance and all this sorts of things. But, what is the Lord your God going to require you? And then he enumerates this, what kind of worship it is that he's looking. But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. What does the Lord your God require of you, O people of God? To fear the Lord your God. Fear here is Strong's, is the word 3372. It's Yahweh. Brown Driver and Briggs, the commentators, say, to fear, to be afraid of doing what the one you fear hates. To stand in awe of. To be in reverence. To fear. That's Yahweh. And then to walk in all of his way. What does the Lord require of you? To walk in all of his ways. This is Strong's 1980 halach. Figuratively, the lexicon says, figuratively, it's walk in all his ways. It's a mode of life, an action, a particular path of one's life. It's where, the idea of halach, to walk in all of his ways, it's like to go on a journey of adventure with God, to walk with him. He'll talk elsewhere, and the prophets can two walk together except they are agreed. To walk in all of his ways, and we're walking in God's ways, in the ways and the paths of a particular path in our life, of what God says this is the way we should go. And then it talks, and what does the Lord their God require of you? But to love him, Strong's 157, ahev, is to have affection for. And in Hebrew, it can be sexually or otherwise. To have affection for, to love, to like, to befriend. And the whole concept of ahev in Hebrew, is 180 degrees is the opposite of to hate. Okay, so love is, contrasted with hate. So we're supposed to love God, have affection for. It wasn't just, mere duty, and I'm doing that. Yes, I'm afraid of doing what he hates, and I'm willing to walk with him on this journey, this adventure, which you never know. You go off, it's sort of like the Lord of the Rings. You step out the door and you hit on an adventure. Where's the road going to lead? Well, you don't know, do you? No, you don't. But you've agreed, you signed on for an adventure. Okay, and then it says, what does the Lord God require of you? But he comes down to the final point, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. To serve the Lord your God, serve here is Strong's 56:47, abad, serve. To work for another, to serve him by labor, to serve as subjects. Okay, just as, king's servants serve him, whatever Lord's servants serve him. Usually in relationship with one's own chiefs or kings, but also used in references, for instance, to priests serving with their Levitical functions. Our service to the Lord our God with all our heart and with all our soul is merely, I would suggest, our reasonable response of duty performed in gratitude for all of God's amazing mercies and kindnesses. We look, this concept of, of being, as our reasonable response of duty carries on into the New Covenant scriptures and the Greek scriptures. Let's go to Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17 and verse 7. Our service to the Lord of God with all our hearts and with all our soul. Luke chapter 17, verse 7, New Living Translation. When a servant comes in from plowing or taking care of sheep, does this master say, "Come in and eat with me"? No, he says, "Prepare my meal and put on your apron and serve me while I eat." And, standing there. Sort of like if you think about from this down, think of Downton Abbey, the master comes in, sits, do the servants sit down and eat with him? No, they're standing, they're ready to serve him. The butler and, the footman and this sort of thing. Prepare my meal, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat. Then you can eat later. And does the master, Jesus said, thank the servant for doing what he was told to do? Of course not, Jesus said. In the same way, he concludes, Luke chapter 17, verse 10, in the same way, when you obey me, you should say, we are unworthy servants who have simply done our duty. Oh. Amplified Bible takes this Luke 17 and verse 10 and translates it this way. So you too, when you have done everything that was assigned and commanded you, say, we are unworthy servants. That is to say, undeserving of praise or reward, for we've not gone beyond our obligation. We have merely done what we ought to do. Jesus says, there's something more even that's required. Just doing, we also have to, in this service, there is, as he said, you have to love the Lord your God with all your heart. This is part of this. It's a big part of it, isn't it? Be willing to walk with him wherever he leads, trusting him, being faithful. This Luke 17:10. This whole idea of the dutiful servant, concludes, if we do what we're asked to do, we've simply done our duty, but that doesn't make us worthy of a big reward. This is a hard saying for many people who think that, when they look at this, and Jesus is making this comment, that while, many people will think that while the Old Testament was, they think the Old Testament was about salvation by works, the New Testament was only about salvation by grace without works. This is what most people think, which means that, they think of it, well, since we're living in New Testament, New Covenant times, we don't have to worship God by keeping the commandments or doing the other works mentioned in the scriptures. But Jesus said, when you have done everything that was assigned and commanded you, say, we're unworthy servants. We've merely done what we ought to do. If you look, the presumption of this idea that the Old Covenant was all about salvation by works while the new covenant was just about salvation by grace, without works. Well, let's look, what does the Bible really teach in this way? And how does this relate to our worship? If you look at the Old Covenant in the Hebrew Bible, if you look at the book of Exodus, we see that in chapters 1 through 19, the first 19 chapters of the book of Exodus, we see that God is depicted. The whole story, the narrative shows that he is showing grace to Abraham's seed, the children of Israel, mercifully, graciously granting them to come before him and to make a covenant with him, to be his people by covenant. We then see in Exodus chapters 20 through 40 that these are all about how those who had received mercy from the Lord, from God, were then called upon to honor God as their Lord and Master by fearing him, walking in all of his ways, loving him even pragmatically, demonstrating their abiding love for him by serving God with all sorts of circumstances and situations, serving him faithfully with everything that were revealed to the people of God. Let's go to Matthew chapter 7, and Matthew chapter 7, back to the Gospels here. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. I'm going to recite this in the Amplified Bible. So that in everything treat others the same way you want them to treat you. Okay, this is Jesus saying, he's teaching the people that, okay, you should be treating others just as you treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. For this is the essence of the law and of the writings of the prophets. So put this in your mind. This is a concept. So it's handy for you to think about everything. I mean, it's a little hard to carry around your reference. In those days, they didn't have a Bible to walk around with. They had to have the big principles. So treat people as you would like to be treated yourself. This is the essence of the law and the writings of the prophets. Then he says this, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad and easy to travel is the path that leads the way to destruction and eternal loss. And there are many who enter through this wide and broad and easy gate. But small is the gate and narrow and difficult to travel is the path that leads the way to everlasting life, and there are few who find it. Because when we receive grace, we also have an obligation for obedience. And that makes things difficult in this life. The truth is that the sort of all-encompassing worship described in Deuteronomy 10:12 that we just talked about, that this sort of all-encompassing worship, God didn't write this or intend this just for his old covenant people. But it is written there for our learning, as Apostle Paul would say. It's God's message to those who are being called now into a new covenant relationship, which is a one-on-one covenant relationship that Jesus facilitates, that we make with God the Father. The old covenant relationship, Moses was the intermediator, and he had the people, the Hebrew people, the children of Israel, make this with one who said, I am who I am, that stood on top of Mount Sinai, who was the Messiah, who came from antiquity, from of old, as the prophet Micah clearly revealed and was cited to even King Herod. Yes, Deuteronomy 10:12 describes an all-encompassing sort of relationship that was not just for the Hebrews, but is also for us who are living right now. Let's go to John. I want to just prove this a little bit here, just this point. That it's far more than just saying, oh yeah, well, I'm saying nice things, I go to church, I sing, and I do these things, and that's my worship. Worship involves more than that. It is this all-encompassing. It is, it's fearing God. It's loving Him. It's doing and walking with Him, doing those things that He asks us to do. Faithfully serving Him. It makes a big, it has a all-encompassing, role in our lives. If we go to 1 John chapter 3 in the general epistles, and here in the Apostle John, 1 John chapter 3, and we'll go to verse 1. 1 John 3 and verse 1. Behold, what glorious, I'm going to read this in Coulter translation. Behold, what glorious love the Father has given to us, that we should be called the children of God. Yes, it's grace that we're called, that God is looking upon us, so He's making us His children, the children of God. For this very reason, the world does not know Him, because it does not know us, because it didn't know Him. The world is ignorant of these things. Beloved, now we are the children of God. John is writing to the church, not to the world. And it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when He is manifested, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him exactly as He is. God is spirit. And, we will be spirit. We will be His, we're going to be the children of the Father. Christ will be our elder brother. We will see Him as He is. Verse 3, he makes John 3, verse 3. And everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself as He is pure. God's whole concept, what He said to the ancient Israelites, you shall be holy as I am holy. And He defined all these things, if you want to put it, His holiness code. It talked about sexual behavior, immorality. It was pretty all-encompassing way of life. That was a way of life that was, you were walking with Him. It's part of your all-encompassing worship. And everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself even as He is pure. Remember, it's the Apostle Peter repeated what was taught in the Old Covenant, that, God said, you should be holy as I am holy. Part of our worship. And then Apostle Peter, actually, we'll get the right one, Paul, Peter. Apostle John, this is 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4. Everyone who practices sin. What is sin? Is also practicing lawlessness, for sin is lawlessness. Greek word here is anomia. A lawlessness, not obeying, not living in accordance, in harmony with the law of God. Not doing, the things that are positively commanding and doing the things which are forbidden. See, it's both sides. Doing what's, the positive aspects of it, do this, or whatever it is, or not, don't do this. Everyone who practices sin is also practicing lawlessness, for sin is lawlessness. And you know that He appeared in order that He might take away our sins, and in Him there is no sin. Everyone who dwells in Him does not practice sin. Anyone who practices a sin has not seen Him, nor has known Him. And you could also add in there, they're certainly not worshiping Him. Little children, do not allow anyone to deceive you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, even as He is righteous, because He's our standard. We worship Him by doing what pleases Him. The one who practices sin, verse 8, is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God appeared, that he might destroy the works of the devil. Everyone who has been begotten by God does not practice sin, because he is seed of begettal dwelling within him. And he is not able to practice sin, because he has been begotten by God. By this standard are manifest the children of God and the children of the devil. Everyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, and neither is he who does not love his brother. This is part of our worship. Walking with God. And as John goes on 2 chapters later, in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 2, John, as he's winding down this letter to the church, he says, by this standard we know we love the children of God when we love God and keep his commandments. Do we love God? That's part of our worship. We love God and keep his commandments. We love God and we serve him. We fear to do what displeases him. We walk in all of his ways. We walk with him. We love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Contrary to the false teaching of many people who say you can't keep God's commandments. I mean, the apostle disagrees with these people. Because if you want to speak theologically, it's Christ in us as New Covenant Christians who provides us with his Spirit that gives us the motivation to do that which is pleasing in his sight, keeping his commandments. Part of our worship to God. Now, as I said, the commandments are things positively do and things not to do. They really are. And it is the same way in the New Covenant Scriptures. There are things to do and things not to do. Aren't there? Sure there are. Let's go to just take a look at one here. We're going to run out of time here. I mean, I can't get all this done in one message, okay? We'll carry this over. But anyways, let's go to Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. The Apostle Paul is going to make this point in writing to the church brethren. He's saying, don't ignore what is true and worship what is false. Okay, this is something Paul is trying to explain to the Romans, something very important. Now, you remember Rome, when he was writing these people, they were living in the capital city of the known world with a seat of power, and they had all these wonderful things. I mean, it was the height of civilization of that time. And Roman civilization was quite advanced in many ways. Remember, most people have sort of forgotten, but, the Romans, when they occupied Britannia, or what we call Britain these days, they had a high level of civilization that the aristocracy, the gentlemen of England, weren't living as well as the Romans until the Victorian era, in the late 19th century, late 1800s. And so, they knew quite a bit. It was an advanced, civilization from that standpoint. So Paul, in writing these people, we're not all that dissimilar to us in our time. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, Amplified Bible Version, Paul says this. He starts off, I am not ashamed of the gospel. The scriptures. He's not, the gospel, it's full of not only what's here in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they're always quoting the prophets, and they're quoting from the law, and they're quoting from all this. It's the scriptures. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. How many people are ashamed of the gospel these days? For it is the power of God for salvation. Why? From his wrath and punishment. God's, salvation is God's operation of rescue and rehabilitation of those whom he chooses and picks. Calls to worship him. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Because we have to love God if we're going to worship him. To the Jew first, those who had the scriptures, And also to the Greek. God's, he's not prejudiced against anybody. Anybody he's willing to have anyone who's willing to respond to him, who's willing to worship him. Verse 17, for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed. Yes, what God does is right. The example he sets, what he commands his people to do, examples of what is right and what is wrong. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, both springing from faith and leading to faith. Of course, springs from his faith and leads to, God's example leads to our faith in worshiping him, that there is a reward, that there's a reason. When you come to God, we got to believe that he exists. And there are real things flow from it. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, both springing from faith and leading to faith. The Amplified editors say that this God's faith is disclosed in such a way that awakens more faith. Sometimes that takes experience and it takes time. You look at, why did this happen? Why did that happen? But God reveals these things as we walk with him. Remember, that's part of worship, walking with him. We learn more about all the time. Our worship grows more informed and more mature. As it is written and forever remains written, the Apostle Paul said, the just and upright shall live by faith. Because we believe that what God has said is for our benefit, for the world's benefit, and it has a payoff. Better than Lotto 649. And far more sure. Let's go to verse 18. Now there are consequences for unbelief, for rejecting God, for not being willing to worship God. Verse 18. For, in the Amplified editor, God doesn't overlook sin, and the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. God doesn't overlook sin. He doesn't. He doesn't give us, through Jesus' sacrifice, a license to continue in the lifestyle of sin. Because if we're going to worship him, we have to do it in spirit and truth. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who in their wickedness suppress and stifle the truth. What does the Lord your God require of you? His true worship requires one to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. We throw ourselves into it. So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who in their wickedness oppress and stifle the truth. Verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them. That's in their inner consciousness, for God made it evident to them. For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen, being understood through his workmanship, which is this incredible universe. Incredible universe, which is so very vast. Billions of light years that we know of. And that's only what can reach us. By the time some of the light that reaches us from 16 billion light years ago or something like this, how much has it expanded in all that period of time? Anyways, now at this time, with all the things we have, from the Hubble telescope on, he said his eternal power and divine nature are clearly seen, being understood through his workmanship. So we should fear the Lord. We should be willing to walk in his ways and to love him and to serve him. So God's nature, his existence, is understood through his workmanship, so that they the people who fail to worship God are without excuse and defense. Because as the editors of the Amplified notice, because such people are guilty of deliberately rejecting God since they have set aside common sense. They're without excuse and without defense because, God expects that they should be willing to worship him as the creator of all life, as their own creator. And that they're without excuse and with defense because common sense should tell them that this is required of the created of the creator. Verse 21, for even though they knew God as creator, they did not honor him as God nor give thanks for his wondrous creation. They wouldn't worship him. On the contrary, they became worthless in their thinking. The Amplified notes godless with pointless reasoning and silly speculations. And their foolish heart was darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of God, exchanged the glory and majesty and excellence of the immortal God for an image. Notice, exchanged the glory and majesty and excellence of the immortal God for an image, whatever worthless idol you could come up with. The Greeks with their statues of the perfect human body, or maybe the Egyptians with their fantastic animals and reptiles that they used to have. You see painted on the ancient hieroglyphics of the Egyptian tombs. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their own heart, to sexual impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, abandoning them to the degrading power of sin, as they notice. The body's dishonored because sin has a negative effect. It degrades people, and the whole purpose of God's revelation is to lift people up so that we can see God as he is, to become holy as he is holy. And when we fear God and we love him and walk with him and serve him, we become holy as he is holy. And we don't find ourselves being degraded because we're insist on living in sin. And Paul concludes his section because he says, because by choice they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They made a choice and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. We'll talk a little bit more about this subject of worship next week. But in the meantime, let's not forget to visit the kissing ground and be willing to worship God and to make whatever, in all necessary gestures in our life to show that we're willing to follow him and walk with him and love him in spirit and in truth.